Not so long ago, Aboriginal people weren't even recognised as the citizens of their own country. They didn't have the right to vote, have legal representation, or even fight for their own land. But in the early 1970s, a group of lawyers, including Robert French and Fred Chaney, got together to give Aboriginal people equity before the law. 40 years later, the Aboriginal Legal Service has become much more than that. A new book documents the story of the ALS, from its humble beginnings to an organisation at the forefront of every major issue facing Aboriginal people today.
I acknowledge the Gadigal, whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with the land Mother Earth, and thank them for allowing us to meet here this evening.
It might be commonplace now, but a welcome to country would have been unheard of only a few decades ago. Up until the late 1970s, Aboriginal people had no legal claim to their land and no way of fighting for it in a court of law.
Liable to arrest if you don't move.
But the story of how all that changed has been documented in a new book.
In 1973, when the Aboriginal Legal Service actually opened their doors, and there was initially just one full-time lawyer, and the stories from that period are just extraordinary.
It was a time when Aboriginal people were being locked up left, right and centre for minor breaches of laws they didn't even understand.
In my parents' era, which wasn't that long ago, they weren't allowed onto the street after dark or after 6 o'clock, so they had to be out of the towns. And if they were in the towns, they were arrested.
Racial discrimination towards Aboriginal people in the operation of the criminal justice system was just endemic, and it was extreme. I mean, they were arrested and jailed for really minor public order offences.
This injustice prompted several Perth lawyers to join forces with a group of local Aboriginal people. Robert French, who's now the Chief Justice of the High Court, led the charge. Fred Chaney, who went on to become a senator, was also keen to help.
We had no formal structure at first. What you had was a group of lawyers who volunteered to be available on an ad hoc basis. None of us were employed. We simply took on cases as we could.
At that time, the ALS was unique in that Aboriginal people played an essential part in running it. Miranda Farmer's father and uncle were the first field officers to work for the ALS.
It was a big deal. There were so many people that were proud that they had. I mean, in the early years they rattled cans to raise money. There wasn't any money to get to Canberra, to lobby.
The ALS field officers and lawyers soon began travelling the state, uncovering hundreds of stories of injustice.
He had a jack in his car which had come from a wreck on the reserve. The police were investigating a crime which he had nothing to do with, asked him where he'd got the jack. He said he found it, and he was locked up for 6 weeks before a lawyer got to him, and ultimately, of course, he was released. But in the meantime, he'd lost his job.
Mr Chaney says the new ALS recruits were given a hard time by the Justices of the Peace, who were largely in control of running the courts in remote areas.
When he stood up to say that he wanted to enter a plea of not guilty, he was told to sit down and shut up. When he said, but I'm trying to appear for this man and enter a plea of not guilty, he was told to sit down and shut up again. And they convicted the man without any evidence at all on a plea of not guilty.
Most magistrates and judges and JPs had never seen an Aboriginal defendant with legal representation before. And, it was a real radical challenge to the way that the justice system operated.
But while it met with resistance from authorities, the ALS was welcomed with open arms by Aboriginal people. It soon evolved from dealing with petty crime cases to providing advice on the most important issue for Aboriginal people in the 1970s, land rights.
You had the court government. Sir Charles Court in Western Australia was the Premier, and it was a government that was just implacably opposed to any recognition of Aboriginal land rights. And so it was a really intense fight right from the beginning.
Despite this, the ALS was instrumental in securing the land rights agreements for the communities at Nukunbar and Umbulgari, paving the way for native title claims in WA. But land rights wasn't the only battle the ALS was fighting.
White lies, black death, no say suicide, murder!
It turned its attention to Aboriginal deaths in custody and was soon pushing for a Royal Commission.
The Aboriginal Legal Service was instrumental in getting the Royal Commission going. and campaigning to get the federal government to set up a national inquiry.
But while the ALS was successful in getting the Royal Commission established in 1987, it came under some heavy criticism itself from Aboriginal families. An executive officer at the ALS told author Fiona Skyring she was confronted by hundreds of families.
They said if the ALS had done their job, my relative would not have been dead. My relative would not have been in prison because many of these people were found hanging in a police cell before even going to court to appear on a charge.
And while the main recommendation of the Royal Commission was to reduce the extent of Aboriginal imprisonment, it's an area where the ALS has failed to have an impact. In fact, the situation is getting worse. While Aboriginal people make up about 3.5% of the population in WA, they account for nearly 40% of the adult prison population. Current CEO Dennis Eggington admits it's an area where the ALS could have done better.
We've concentrated our efforts on make sure that our people are getting a fair representation, and it's come at the expense of helping resolve some of those other issues and bigger picture stuff.
And incarceration rates isn't the only issue the ALS has been criticised over.
Aboriginal women have come forward and said that the Aboriginal Legal Service discriminates against women not only within its employment, but also in terms of providing services for Aboriginal women and children. Obviously in relation to domestic violence, where in most instances the ALS would represent the perpetrator rather than the victim of domestic violence.
But despite its downfalls, the ALS is credited with helping thousands of clients over the last 40 years.
I think it's gone from the amateur hour, well-meaning amateurs, well-meaning volunteers, to a highly professional organisation. I think it continues to struggle with the multiplicity of issues that it feels it has to address, and I for one hope that we can get on top of those issues soon.
Its chief executive hopes the organisation will evolve even further to move out of the courtroom and help bring about real social change for Aboriginal people.
If there is a future, it's building a niche for ourselves in those areas where the community aren't just coming to us for help because of criminal matters, but I've got the Aboriginal Legal Service working in a way that's strengthening the communities, strengthening the families, and adding to the improvement of well-being for our people.
Rebecca Boschler there.